everybody. Great to be with you on a Friday. Let's light up the darkness. Just to give you the update, I had this oral surgery on Tuesday. I was able to talk in the afternoon on Tuesday, so I thought I might be able to teach the class Tuesday evening, and it was not a good idea. It was still very tender and sore. The soreness has been much reduced. It's uncomfortable, but it's not so sore. I have this sort of like a putty around the gums of the molars, upper and lower on this side. And that's just kind of acting as a dressing around the sutures. So, it looks a little swollen, but it's really more that putty around the sutures that's making me look swollen. It's not so bad. I haven't talked for an hour in a row, all week. So hopefully I'll be able to get through the class. I think it's okay. If I get very tired and achy, I'll let you know. But for now, I think I'm going to be able to get through it. And thank you so much to everybody who sent me well wishes for refuah shlema, for a healing. I truly appreciate it. Who's in the house? Bill in mid-Missouri, Leon in southern Illinois, Nancy in North Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Gordo in Scotland, Tracy in Oklahoma, Belle in a hot and humid Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in California, right? Renee, thank you everybody for the good wishes. Marjorie checking in from Virginia. I'm going to try to do the highlights of 2 pages since we're a little bit behind. But I'm going to keep it on the short side overall just so I don't, strain the jaw too much as it were. Okay. So our dafs today are 42 and 43 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of divorce. We are on an extended digression. We sort of got into it by discussing that I think it was Rabban Gamliel decreed that witnesses of the get of the bill of divorce have to sign it. Remember, really it's enough if they just are there to witness that the get, that the bill of divorce is given to the wife. That's the moment that creates the divorce. But it's better for the society, or tikkun ha'olam, for the betterment of the world, that the witnesses would sign the get so they could be found later if the get was challenged. And once we got into tikkun ha'olam concepts, we found a bunch of others, and like the prosbul that would enable people to borrow money even as the sabbatical year was approaching. And with that, we also came to some laws about owners and slaves. As slavery was practiced in the ancient world, when the Torah came along, it very much limited the kind of abuse that could be leveled on a slave. Still a horrific institution, but it was so widespread when the Torah came along, the law of slavery as written in the Torah, sort of addressed the world as it was, but created all kinds of rights for the slave and obligations of the owner to the slave. So we continue this discussion on page 42a, but because we're doing a highlight show and I don't want to strain the jaw too much today, like I said, it's highlights. So on 42a, I'm just going to read you a couple of halachas where the law came out as a result of the discussion on page 42a. So if a master, just to add to the fun, right now I'm not really sore from the jaw, but because of that putty, I also have a canker sore on my inner mouth, like where it meets that, just irritated, right? So that's just kind of irritation. It's not the pain of the surgery. Whatever, I'm sure you're tired of hearing about it. Okay, if a master emancipates half of his slave via a bill of manumission, then the slave does not acquire half of himself, and he remains a slave as he was, right? So remember that we had this law that if two masters own a slave, right, they have shared ownership of a slave. If, for example, their father owned a slave and then they inherited, just the one slave between them, so they were co-owners of him, and then one of the masters freed his half of the slave, so the other master would be forced to free his half and the slave would go free, but the slave would owe his value as a slave to the master that was forced to free him, but at least he would go free. But but here what we're learning is that if an owner says to a slave, you are half free, I'm your only owner, but I'm only making you half free, well, then the slave does not go free. What you might say is that now it will only cost you half of your redemption value to make yourself fully free. That's what it might mean, that an owner makes his slave half free, but he doesn't become free as a result of that statement. Now, this applies when the master had total ownership of the slave and attempted to retain half. However, if he sold or gave the other half to someone else, whether prior to or concurrent with the half emancipation, then the slave acquires his half and the purchaser or recipient takes possession of the other half in accordance with the opinion of Rabbah, and then presumably that other owner would have to free that half, although he would be owed the value of that half of the slave. The second law on this page, if one emancipates his two slaves, right? Somebody has two slaves, and emancipates both of them with one bill of manumission, right? Seeking to free both slaves with one document, then they are not emancipated. Therefore, if one writes one document granting all of his property to two of his slaves, then they do not even acquire themselves. They acquire the property, but they don't acquire themselves. If one wrote two documents, they acquire the property and they emancipate each other. When does this apply? When the master wrote in each document, all of my property is given to so-and-so, my slave, and he transfers them to the slaves simultaneously. However, if he wrote half of my property to so-and-so, my slave, and half of my property to so-and-so, my slave, then they do not acquire anything, even if he wrote it in two documents, and the Gemara explains why, although we're not going to go into it today. We skip to the bottom of page 42a, and the same thing, because it's a highlight show, I'm going to read you where the law came out of the discussion. If a half slave, half free man was injured, right? So how could he be half slave, half free? If we just said that one who's owned by two owners and one of them frees him, the other one has to free him also. But that is where the law ended up, right? That was according to Beis Shammai, that in that situation, the second master has to free the slave. But prior to that, Beis Hillel held that you could be half slave, half free, and you would work one day for the master, one day for yourself, one day for the master, one day for yourself. And so this would address that condition as it existed before the law came to be like Beis Shammai on this question. So if a half slave, half free man was injured, shamed, or pained by a person, and if it is the type of injury that will heal completely, and if the damage occurred on a day when he was working for his master, then payment is due to the master. If this occurred on a day when he was working for himself, the payment is due to him. If the damage was permanent, then the payment is split between the master and the slave, who is split between the person who is half slave and half free. Now, to understand this a little better, again, this is in a world that we don't understand, but a world in which slavery existed and was common. So slaves were property and they had value as property. And so if a slave was damaged, right, so that would cause damage to the property of the owner, and the owner would receive restitution for that. If the damage to a person who's free, obviously he gets the damages, right? I mean, the rabbinic courts had all kinds of ways of calculating damages when a person is injured. Ancient tort law, as it were. But if he was half and half, well, so then who gets the damages? and that's what this law addresses. If a person who was half slave and half free was killed by an ox, then the owner of the ox pays neither a fine nor ransom. Now, these are specific sort of legal terms that in the law of damages. If a half maidservant, half free woman was killed by an ox, then the owner of the ox pays half of the penalty to her master, and the owner of the ox is exempt from paying half of the ransom. This is the opinion of the Tur. While it appears that the Rambam does not make the distinction between a slave and a maidservant, but maintains that the owner of the ox is liable in either case, the Maggid Mishna explains the Rambam's opinion is in fact in accordance with the opinion of the Tur. We don't have to go too deep in the weeds on that. Now we're on 42b, and now we're actually going to pick up the discussion in the Gemara. So a dilemma was raised before the sages. If a slave is detained in his master's possession only due to not having received a bill of manumission, but he is no longer obligated to perform labor for his master. What is this situation? For example, in a case where his master declared the slave to be ownerless, right? So his master said, "You are now ownerless." Sounds like he's free, but he didn't really remove him from slavery. He just said, "I am not your owner," right? To make him fully free, we've already seen this law that the sages declared that the master must write that bill of manumission so that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that the slave has fully become a free person again. Right? So in that situation where the master has declared him ownerless but has not yet given the bill of manumission, so he can't make the slave work anymore, he doesn't own the slave anymore, but the slave is still around waiting for the bill of manumission. Okay. And by the way, the reason that so many of these laws about slavery are in this tractate about divorce is because the bill of manumission shares many legal similarities to the get, the bill of divorce. Okay, so if a slave is detained in this situation, awaiting the bill of manumission, so does he render liable one whose ox kills him to pay the penalty of 30 shekels to his master, or does he not render one liable to pay the penalty? Now, the penalty is a specific value for this situation of the killing. There may be other damages involved, but the question is, do you have to pay this penalty that the Torah mandates that if your ox gores a slave, you owe the master 30 shekels. Now, the master doesn't own the slave anymore, but the slave is still in the master's household awaiting that bill of manumission. So if he's gored by an ox during this period, does the owner of the ox owe that 30 shekels to the master or not? So the Gemara analyzes this question. The merciful one states in the Torah, he shall give 30 shekels of silver to his master, Exodus 21:32. And this is not his master, as in practice the slave has already been declared ownerless. Or perhaps, since he is lacking the bill of manumission, the former owner is still called his master. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof for this question based on what is taught in the Baraisa. If an ox killed one who is half slave, half free, then the owner of the ox gives half of a penalty, i.e. 15 shekels, to the slave's master, and half of a ransom, i.e. half of the value of the deceased, to his heirs. So what? Is the Baraisa not in accordance with the ultimate version of the Mishnah after Beis Hillel conceded to Beis Shammai that the master is forced to emancipate a person who is half slave and half free, and he is merely lacking a bill of manumission? Despite this, the Baraisa states that the master receives the money of half the penalty. And the Gemara answers, no. The Baraisa, this Baraisa, is in accordance with the initial version of the Mishnah, and in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, who held that one who was half slave and half free because he was formerly owned by two masters and one of the masters freed him, that now he works for himself one day and for his half master one day. And so this Baraisa is in accordance with that view. Now the Gemara suggests, wait a minute, come in here a proof based on what is taught in a Baraisa. If the master knocked out the slave's tooth and then blinded his eye, then the slave is emancipated due to the loss of his tooth. As the verse states, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. Now, that's something the Torah says explicitly, that if a master harms his slave in a permanent way, like by knocking out his tooth or blinding him, or even knocking out one eye, then the slave goes free. For sure, before the Torah was given, and for people who don't follow the Torah, where slavery was so common in the ancient world, doing damage to your own slave would make the slave go free. That was such a radical innovation in the world. It was, crazy, right? But now the point is how we're using that law to understand our question here, right? So this slave who was freed, or at least declared ownerless, but has not yet received that bill of manumission, what are we going to learn about that question? When that person is gored by an ox, does the owner of the ox pay the former owner, but who still hasn't given the bill of manumission? And here we're looking at this question, right, of a master who both knocked out the tooth and blinded the slave. Now the slave goes free because he knocked out the tooth. And the master gives him reimbursement for the value of his eye as though he were a free man. Right? So perhaps the injury happened together. Like this evil master, he swung a hard object into the slave's face, and it both, knocked out his tooth and his eye. So because of the tooth, the slave goes free, and because of the loss of the eye, the master now has to pay him as if he damaged a free person's eye. And if you say that a slave that did not yet receive a bill of manumission does render one whose ox kills him liable to pay the penalty, and the penalty is paid to his master, then one could ask, well, now if other people injure him, then they give the payment to his master. If his master himself injures him, then should he give the payment for the slave's eye to him? Right? In other words, if in one blow, the master knocked out the slave's tooth and his eye, okay, well then he goes free automatically because of the tooth, but he hasn't yet given him this bill of manumission. So if the money is now owed to the former slave who went free because of the tooth and now receives the money and damages because of the eye, that would seem to indicate that if a person's ox, gored this person who is declared ownerless by his master but not yet received the bill of manumission, it would seem that payment, it would not be a penalty to the master or former master of the slave, but rather damages for the life lost to the heirs of the slave, it would seem. Now, the Gemara answers, perhaps this Baraisa is in accordance with the one who said that when a slave is emancipated because his master knocked out his tooth, he does not need a bill of manumission and is automatically emancipated the moment his tooth is knocked out, as it is taught in a Baraisa, different Baraisa. For all of them, for all 24 limbs about which the sages said that a slave is emancipated if his master damages one of them, a slave is emancipated by means of them, and he requires a bill of manumission from his master. This is the statement of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Meir says he does not require a bill of manumission. Rabbi Eliezer says he requires it. Rabbi Tarfon says he does not require it. Rabbi Kiva says he requires it. Right? So we have, a lot of different views about whether the slave whose tooth is knocked out, he goes free immediately, but does he still have some kind of a bond with the former owner in terms of that the guy has to give him the bill of manumission? According to some views, yes. According to some views, no. Now, those who rule before the sages, i.e., those who attempt to rule by finding a middle ground between the different opinions, say like this. The statement of Rabbi Tarfon that the slave does not require a bill of manumission seems correct in the case of a tooth or an eye, since the Torah transferred his freedom to him explicitly. And the statement of Rabbi Akiva that he does require a bill of manumission seems correct in the case of other limbs, since it is a rabbinic penalty that he goes free. The Torah said if you knock out the slave's tooth or eye, he goes free. The sages added, well, if you chop off his leg, if you chop off his finger, all these other ideas that they derive from the eye and the tooth, but which are not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. So the Gemara questions the wording used. Is it a rabbinic penalty? Don't we interpret verses to conclude that a slave is emancipated when any of the 24 limbs are damaged by the master? Rather say as follows, the statement of Rabbi Akiva seems correct in the case of other limbs, since it is an interpretation of the sages, and it is not written explicitly in the Torah. And this question of the Gemara remains unresolved. So where did the law come out on this? If a master intentionally strikes his slave and damages one of the 24 extremities, then the slave goes free. According to Tosafot and the Rosh, this is the ruling even if the wound is inflicted inadvertently. The Beis Yosef, citing Rabbeinu Yerucham, rules that the master must give the slave a bill of manumission and is even forced to do so. And we leave that discussion behind. Now we're on page 43a, and the sages are discussing if a master owns a slave. And we understand that there's this penalty spelled out in the Torah that if an ox gores a slave, then the master receives 30 shekels. So the question that they ask, I'm sure this never came up in the real world, but it's a question that the sages asked to test their understanding and our understanding of the law, is can that master sell the right to receive the 30 shekels in case the slave is gored? The slave hasn't been gored. Most slaves go their whole lives without being gored by an ox and being killed by the ox. So this is a kind of cheap insurance policy, right? Or not cheap, but I mean, it's sort of like, all insurance policies are a kind of casino, right? I mean, you and the insurance company are playing a game of chance. You want to protect your family because in the event that you die young, what are they gonna do without you? They're gonna need that insurance. So you pay it at a certain premium. When you're young, if you start the insurance premiums when you're young, it's gonna be much cheaper than if you start it when you're old, because as people get older, more of them die every year. People who are that age, right? That curve goes up. But any kind of insurance, is calculated. That's what actuaries do, right? And they look at statistics and they say, how likely is this to happen? If we sell 1 million insurance policies, how many of them will we have to pay? And they have to make sure that they collect more money in total premiums than what they would have to pay out, right? So here, they're looking at the question, maybe, it's so unlikely that it's ever going to happen. But in case it does happen, maybe I don't know. Maybe the master is walking with a friend, and the slaves are doing work, and there's a stampede coming, and then these heartless guys say, I'll tell you what. If my slave might get gored by an ox today, in which case I would get 30 shekels, I'll sell you the right to receive those 30 shekels for 5 shekels now. And the guy says, well, why not? I'll take a chance. And so he pays the 5 shekels, and then he has purchased the right to receive the 30 shekels if the slave is gored. All right, so let's put the morality aside. The question here is, can this be done at all? The slave hasn't been gored yet. There's no guarantee that he will be gored. In fact, it's most probable that he will not be gored. So can you sell a penalty payment that doesn't exist yet and may never exist? Can you sell something that does not yet exist? A more common example of this is, I will sell you the egg, that my chicken lays tomorrow. Now, the chicken maybe lays eggs every day. So this is a pretty common thing that you can expect that the chicken will lay an egg tomorrow. But can I sell it today when that egg does not yet exist? This is a very interesting halakhic question. So on that question, the law is like this. One cannot transfer an entity that has not yet come into the world, regardless of whether it is a sale or a gift. If one sold or gave his fellow produce that has not yet come into the world, or a calf that has not yet been born, even if the cow was pregnant, then the recipient does not acquire it. We don't sell these kinds of futures. Now, the giver or seller may retract his commitment after the produce grew or after the animal gave birth. Nevertheless, if the recipient sees the item after it came into being, the court does not appropriate it from him. If one sold a tree, but only with regard to the rights to its produce, or a cow, but only with regard to the rights to its offspring, then the sale takes effect immediately, and neither party may retract from the arrangement because you're selling something that already exists. Now, that's a nuanced difference, right? The cow exists. Can I sell you the right to get all the calves that come from that cow? Sounds like yes, but I can't sell you tomorrow's calf. That we're going to study this at much greater length in future tractates. But for now, it has to do with this question of the slave. And that's where the law came out. We skip down to the end of page 43a. I'm trying to keep the class a little bit short today. Just my jaw is good, but I don't want to talk too long. Okay, so more halachas. Teruma and teruma of the tithe, right? So teruma is when the temple is standing, the first 2% of produce harvested from a field or wine created, in a winery, gets tithed, right? So the first 2% is consecrated that only a priest can consume it in a state of purity. Both the priest and the teruma must be pure. Teruma of the tithe. So this is even the Levites who receive the next 10% of the produce. When they receive it, they have to set aside 10% of that and give it to the priest. So teruma and teruma of the tithe may be eaten by members of the priestly household, whether they are adult or minor priests, the wives or daughters of priests, or even Canaanite slaves, which is why it comes up here. And there is no difference whether the slave has monetary value or not. If a half-slave, half-free man betrothed a Jewish woman, then she is considered to be betrothed as a matter of uncertainty, as the Gemara did not resolve whether or not she is betrothed, and this matter pertains to a prohibition by Torah law. And if one says to a woman, become betrothed to half of me, then she is betrothed. However, if he said to her, half of you is betrothed to me, then she is not betrothed, because one woman cannot be betrothed to two men. Whereas, under ancient law, a man couldn't have two wives. That's why she could be betrothed to half of him, but he cannot be betrothed to half of her. Did anyone ever say, I'm betrothed to half of you, or you are betrothed to half of me? No, I'm sure it never said. No one ever said that. We're just testing our understanding of the law. Similarly, if one says, behold, you are betrothed to me and to so-and-so, then she is not betrothed at all. Skip forward a little bit to the bottom of 43a. If an ox killed a man who is half slave and half free, then the owner of the ox pays half of the penalty to the slave's master, but he's exempt from paying half the ransom. According to the ultimate version of the Mishnah, the master would collect the fine only in the case of a half maidservant, half free woman, and this ruling is in accordance with Rava's statement that it is fitting for heirs to take the ransom, but it does not actually have heirs. And now on 43b, I'm going to read to you a couple more halachas, and then we'll get into actual discussion. If one engages in sexual intercourse with a designated maidservant, meaning a female slave who was designated to produce more slaves, right, by having sex with a male slave. So if one, so meaning if a free person engages in sexual intercourse with a designated maidservant, he is required to bring a guilt offering. The designated maidservant discussed in the Torah is a half maidservant, half free woman who was designated to cohabit with a Hebrew slave. If a half maidservant, half free woman was betrothed to Reuven, then she was emancipated. Then she was betrothed to Reuven's brother Shimon, and then both of the brothers died. So then she enters into Yibum, levirate marriage, with Levi, their brother. This is not an instance of the halakhic concept, the wife of two dead men, because one of the betrothals is certainly invalid in accordance with the ruling of Rav Chisda. And we discussed cases, like that, and even greater complexity when we read Tractate Yevamos. Okay, another two halachas, and then we're going to go to Mishnah number 7 and actually read the Gemara on that. If one betroths a woman who is half maidservant and half free, the betrothal is completed only when she is emancipated. If another man betrothed her after she was emancipated, then it is uncertain to which of them she is betrothed, and she therefore requires a get from both of them. Alternatively, the first man can divorce her and the second one can marry her. This is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda and based on uncertainty with regard to the ruling in the dispute between Rav Yosef Bar Chama and Rabbi Zera. But if she was free, they will be put to death. If a designated maidservant who is half maidservant and half free woman betrothed to a Hebrew slave is then fully emancipated, one who engages in sexual intercourse with her is liable to receive the death penalty as if he engaged in forbidden sexual intercourse with a married woman. Again, death penalty in cases of adultery, one is liable to the death penalty. It's not that a court steps in and, convicts an adulterer and kills him. The death penalty was only applied in cases like this if the one contemplating adultery, right before he committed the adultery, somebody said to him, if you commit adultery, you're going to receive the death penalty. And this warning was given in front of two witnesses. And then the person engaged in the adultery immediately after hearing the warning. Then maybe he would actually receive the death penalty. But what we're really talking about here is who is actually liable to receive the death penalty. In other words, who has committed the act of adultery. And here the question is, when somebody's coming out of slavery, is it actually adultery or not? And so in this case, it would be. Now, according to the Maggid Mishnah, this applies only if the Hebrew slave had engaged in sexual intercourse with her beforehand. The Torah writes that one who engages in sexual intercourse with her is liable to bring a guilt offering, just as when she was a designated maidservant, because she has not fully emerged from slavery yet. Rav Huna Bar Katina says that Rabbi Yitzchak says an incident occurred involving one woman who was half maidservant and half free, and they forced her master to emancipate her, and he made her a free woman. So the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is it? Is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, who says, for both Adam and Eve, the verse states, and God blessed them, and God said to them, Peru urevu, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, indicating that the mitzvah to procreate is incumbent upon women as well, and therefore a half maidservant, half free woman must be freed so that she can procreate. Is that the reason? No, we know that because as we've learned before, Women are not obligated to reproduce. Men are. Why are women not obligated to have children? Because particularly in the ancient world, it was dangerous to have children, right? A woman could always die in childbirth. Chances were small, but present, right? And it happened, much more than we could imagine in our world, where we have modern medicine. So, because it was dangerous for a woman to bear children, if she didn't want to have children, she didn't have to. Men don't share that danger, so men are obligated. According to Beis Hillel, they've only fulfilled their obligation when they have a boy and a girl. According to Beis Shammai, when they have 2 boys, and the law follows Beis Hillel. So men only fulfill that obligation when they fathered at least a male and a female. Does every man have children? No. Have they committed a sin if they don't have children? No. They should keep trying if it's at all possible and conceivable for them, but we know that it's not possible for everyone to have children, right? So that's the way it works. So this idea of freeing a woman who's half slave and half free is the reason that we're obligated to free her, so that, or in that instant that they were obligated to free her so that she could reproduce? No. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, no, it need not be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, as the reason that in this particular instance her master was forced to emancipate her was because she was unable to marry, and other men took liberties with her. Right? Because this woman who is half slave and half free is not permitted to marry, and having licentious sex with her, extramarital sex with her, is not technically adultery, because she's neither a free woman nor a free married woman, and so this was like some kind of a loophole, right? And men were cohabiting with her, and the rabbis in that locality wanted to end that practice, so they forced her master to free her, and now that loophole would not exist. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. We're on 43b, and here is Mishnah number 7, here in chapter 4 of Tractate Gittin. In a case of one who sells his slave to Gentiles, or even to a Jew who lives outside of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the slave is emancipated. That's the Mishnah. Here's the explanation from Rav Steinsaltz. Since the slave who is partially obligated in the fulfillment of mitzvahs, of commandments, would be restricted in his ability to fulfill them in his new situation, if he was formerly owned by a Jew and now owned by a Gentile, he's not going to be able to perform the mitzvahs that he could have performed, in the household of an observant Jew. Or even if a Jew who purchases him, who lives outside of Israel, there's certain mitzvahs that you can only perform in the land of Israel. So the slave was better off when he had a Jewish master who lived in the land of Israel. And since we never want to curtail somebody's ability to fulfill commandments, this slave now goes free. Right? Since the slave was partially obligated in the fulfillment of commandments, would be restricted in his ability to fulfill them in his new situation, either because he would be under the authority of a Gentile or because he will no longer be in the land of Israel. The sage has penalized his original owner, who would sell him to a Gentile or to a Jew who lives outside Israel. So therefore the slave should become a free man, so that if he succeeds in escaping his new owner, he is a full-fledged free man, right? We free him. He was already sold to the Gentile, but if he escapes from that Gentile, he's free. We're not going to put him back into slavery. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The sages taught, in a case of one who sells his slave to Gentiles, the slave is emancipated, but nevertheless requires a bill of manumission from his first master. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, in what case is this statement said? When the master did not write a document for him. But if he wrote a document for him, then this is his emancipation, and he does not require a bill of manumission. So interesting that what is this document? It's some kind of a document that frees the slave, but is not a bill of manumission. The Gemara asks, what is the nature of this document? And Rav Shesha said, he writes to him like this: when you will escape from the Gentile, I have no business with you. Even though this is not an explicit bill of manumission, it is sufficient for him to be considered a free man. The sages, for some reason I'm reminded of Huckleberry Finn. But I only read that book in high school so many decades ago, so I don't know why I'm reminded of that. The sages taught if he borrows from a Gentile on the basis of the slave, i.e. using the slave as collateral so that the creditor can collect the slave in payment of the debt in the event that the debtor defaults, then once the Gentile behaves with the slave according to his law, the slave is emancipated, just like a slave was sold to a Gentile. And the Gemara asks, what is defined as his law? And the Gemara answers, Rav Huna Bar Yehuda said, he places a seal, nashke, upon him. What is a seal? There are versions of the text which read nashme, meaning the stamp and neck chain of a slave. Others suggest that the word is related to the Latin noxa, meaning either one who suffers or a bracelet. It was customary in many locations for a slave to wear some sort of chain around his arm or neck as a sign of his slavery. Rav Sheshes raises an objection to this based on a Baraisa. If there was a field owned by a Gentile, but there were Jewish sharecroppers or Jewish tenant farmers or Jewish family sharecroppers, i.e. an entire family of sharecroppers who work a field generation after generation, or in the case of a Gentile who mortgaged his field to a Jew, then even though the Gentile acted for the Jew based on the Jew's law, the field is exempt from tithes because the field belongs to a Gentile. It is not considered as if it were transferred to a Jew, right? A Jew who owns a field in the land of Israel has to tithe all the produce. But if he is a worker, even a sharecropper, even a generational sharecropper of a field that is owned by a Gentile, then he does not tithe the produce. And if it enters your mind that the phrase his law means a seal, meaning a marker that the slave is a slave, is a field able to be sealed? Rather, Rav Sheshes says, the expression that he acted for him based on his law means time. In other words, a deadline was set, and if the debt was not paid by the given date, the slave would automatically be transferred to the possession of the Gentile. So the Gemara asks, if that is so, there is a difficulty with regard to the issue of time in the case of the slave and the issue of time in the case of the field. In the case of the slave, the halacha, the law, is that after the set time, he leaves the debtor's authority and is emancipated. While in the case of the field, its produce does not become obligated to be tithed like the produce of a Jew's field after that set time. So the Gemara answers, this is not difficult since the following distinction can be made. This, the case of the slave who was emancipated, is referring to when his time to be transferred has arrived. And this, the case of the field, is referring to where its time to be transferred has not yet arrived. The Gemara asks, but with regard to a slave whose time to be transferred has arrived, does it need to be said that he is emancipated? Isn't it obvious that once he is transferred to the authority of the Gentile, he is emancipated, just as in the case of a sale? Rather, the Gemara offers a different explanation. This case and that case are referring to when his time to be transferred has not yet arrived. And it is not difficult. This, the case of the slave who was emancipated, is with regard to the slave himself, as the slave himself is to be transferred to the Gentile. And that case is with regard to the produce. In other words, the Jewish creditor has the rights to the produce of the field, but he does not take possession of the actual field. Therefore, it remains exempt from tithes. Last paragraph that I'm going to read, then I'm going to comment some questions. This is at the top of page 44a. And if you wish, say instead, even if the time for the slave of the field to be taken as collateral had arrived. There is something novel about this in a case where he borrowed on the condition that the creditors collect from it, i.e. the slave of the field, but they did not yet collect from it. Since the field had not yet been collected from the Gentile by the Jew as payment of the debt, it remains exempt from tithes, but the mere fact that the Jew agreed to have his slave be collected suffices for the rabbinic penalty to take effect, and the slave is emancipated. So the nuance that we're looking at there, you're not permitted to sell your slave. A Jew is not permitted to sell his Canaanite slave to a Gentile because the level of holiness of the slave will go down. Once he's owned by the Gentile, he's not going to be able to perform the mitzvahs that are incumbent on a slave owned by a Jewish owner, as that was practiced in ancient Israel. And once you've established that principle, okay, that's if you just outright sell the slave. But what if you create conditions where the slave is collateral in a loan by the Gentile or to the Gentile, and then the slave is going to be transferred, but has he been transferred yet or not, is where we get into the nuances that we were just discussing there. Okay, let's go to some comments or questions. Bill, here is a question that may be moot, depending on whether I've remembered facts correctly. As I remember it, a slave was owned by two masters, and one frees him, and he becomes half free. Beis Shammai say he's wholly free, but he owes half his value to the second master, and Beis Hillel comes to agree. Now, my question, is this debt the former slave now owes subject to the sabbatical year? That is, can he end up paying much less than half his value if he's freed in the closing months before the sabbatical year, for example? Wonderful question. I don't know. If you're right, then they might create a prosbul in that situation so that he still has to owe the value. And I guess the only question is, why wouldn't we say that that debt is canceled? Perhaps because the debt is owed to the master, but the situation that creates the debt is an order from the court, right? The master didn't agree to that. He didn't agree to be in that situation where he's owed money. The court forced it. And because the court forced it, perhaps such a debt doesn't get canceled by the Shemitah year. But I'm not sure. Great question. And Joseph asks, if a slave escapes and becomes free, but he never finished his work, can the value of that work be repaid somehow? I mean, like in this situation, right, where the Jewish owner sells him to the Gentile knowing what the law is, it'd be a very sneaky thing to do, right? This would be an underhanded thing. Like we don't, it's, the morality of this is so weird, because we can't stand the thought of slavery. But let's just say in the ancient world, right? So if this Jew, knowing that the slave under Jewish law becomes free when he's sold to the Gentile, says to the slave, you should know that if you escape, you're going to be free. I'm going to get your value from that Gentile, but if you escape from him, no one will take you back to the Gentile. Let's say a Gentile living in Israel. And so if you can manage to escape, which is not necessarily that hard to do, just into the surrounding society, then no one's going to give you back to the Gentile. He's going to lose the possession of you. But from the Gentile's point of view, he just got ripped off. He thought he was purchasing a perfectly good slave that would remain his slave, and now he's gone. So does that original seller owe him the value of the slave or of the work that he was going to perform? I don't know. But that's a great question. That's what I've got for us today. I should have said this at the outset. I'm saying it now retroactively. Our class today, all our learning today is dedicated to the memory of my dear friend, Rabbi Aaron Parry. I just learned this morning that he passed away suddenly last night. He's been at our Shabbos table many times. I'm sure I interviewed him on AT. We should find that video. He actually wrote the book, The Talmud for Dummies, which is a very sophisticated, beautiful book. But making the sort of general terms of the Talmud accessible to anyone. The Talmud for Dummies, Rabbi Aaron Parry, Parry. I know it's available on Amazon. He's a father, a grandfather many times over, father of 9 children, a grandfather of many. He was just here last Shabbos. I'm the gabbai at the afternoon service on Shabbos, and I was looking to give the aliyah to a Levite, which I often have to give to myself if there's no other Levite in the room. But Rabbi Parry and I shared the same birthday, June 16th, and we're both Levium. And he walked in at exactly that moment last Shabbos, and I said, "Rabbi Parry, great timing. You get the aliyah." And we just learned this morning that he passed away suddenly from a heart attack yesterday. May his soul have a tremendous aliyah in the world of souls. May his soul be wrapped in the bonds of eternal life. May his large and beautiful and spirited family, just like him, be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Rav Aaron, I miss you. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to you. And may our learning today give you just a tiny bit more merit than you already have. Oceans of merit that you already have, but it may add a little bit to your merit in the world of souls. I love you, brother. I miss you. We dedicate our learning to you. And with that, dear friends, I say good Shabbos. Have a really sweet and refreshing and uplifting and rejuvenating Shabbos. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night when Shabbos ends. We're at the latest Shabbos of the year. And I'll just try to get on the air, as soon as I can after Shabbos ends, like around 9:30 p.m. Tomorrow night, 9:30 p.m. Pacific. All the best.